Hey guys, I want to start a little mini series on the types of dieting methods available to us and what we can learn from each one. So, this particular segment, I'm going to focus on ketogenic dieting, which is low carb, higher fat dieting. And I know you've heard me reference this before, and I've told you that it's not my favorite for a couple reasons. Physiologically, long term, it's inferior. For sustainability, long term, it's inferior. Studied in comparison to lower fat, higher carb diets, when subjects are controlled, their environment is controlled, so they're inpatient studies, the lower fat diet wins. And when it comes to metabolism and anabolism, the ability to gain muscle mass and so forth, the higher carb diet wins every time. So I think the case is closed. It's just inferior, and it's more difficult. It's more restrictive. Studies even show cognitively it's less effective. But people who love this kind of diet would say almost the opposite on every one of those points. They say, no, cognitively I feel better because I'm not getting that blood sugar undulation and so forth. But I would say that maybe they've never done a higher carb diet with enough quality. I mean, of course, if you're just eating candy and so forth, or a lot of, huge amounts of carbs, you're going to not be as sharp. So all of these studies were done in more controlled elements where some of these factors were all looked at. And I'm not going to sit here and spend the entire segments bashing low carb diets. That wasn't my intent at all. I just want you to know that that's why I don't prefer it. I will give a nod to the people doing research on things like epilepsy, stage 4 cancer, things like that, where zero carb or very low carb ketogenic diets are helpful, almost life-saving, and they are. So again, there's always a great application for something that's really extreme, and it's just another great tool to have at your disposal. So what I want to do for our purposes is say, with that as a backdrop, knowing that this is kind of an extreme technique, it's not very practical. Not a lot of people enjoy it or get the full value of it because it's so hard to stay on. There are some principles we can learn, and we can use that to our advantage. So remember, one of the negatives about ketogenic dieting is that, first of all, carbs are hard to avoid, right? The problem with it as an entire conceptual premise is that you can't have carbs. Your child's birthday, you can't have that birthday cake. You want to have pizza. Sorry, I can't eat it. I just have to scrape the fat and the pepperoni off the top. That's all I can eat. I mean, those kind of things are horrible. And I've always said the only people who succeed on a low carb diet are the people who cheat, because you're going to get carbs at some point. And so they're not really on a low-carb diet or a ketogenic diet. They're just kind of vacillating back and forth. Those are the only people who really do well. And in fact, that's why in those studies, when they're looking at self-reported data, the low-carb people often do a little bit better because they're probably cheating. Because when you have an inpatient controlled environment, they never win. So there again, comes down to practicality and sustainability as huge parts of it. But we do know carbs have to be managed. If you go back to metabolic positioning, this is that conundrum I said. We have the fact that we need carbs. Carbs are good. Carbs are our friends. That we need them for our metabolism. We need it for that anabolic environment. We even need it for fat loss. The Krebs cycle, cellular energy, needs glucose. But too much carbohydrates, and then we've lost all that advantage. We can't lose body fat. We can actually gain body fat easier due to the action of insulin. So I don't like to say we have to meet in the middle. I'm not a big fan of the concept of balance. I like to look at pros and cons and just say, what's the best thing for this context? And that bodes really well for this conversation, which is about how to use those elements, those components of ketogenic dieting to our advantage. So number one, I think we need to define it just a little bit tighter. Ketogenic dieting often gets used as a term to describe two different types of diets. One is truly medical ketogenic dieting, which is high fat. So if somebody's on a true ketogenic diet, it's not that their protein is way up. Protein is actually pretty low, and carbs, of course, don't even exist. And so they're eating just a lot of fat. I know people who, this is going to gross some of you out, who put an entire stick of butter in a cup of coffee, in one cup of coffee, and it's almost like just drinking cream. They say it tastes fantastic. Yeah. And just tons of extra fat. So even in their protein sources, they're getting a lot of high amounts of fat, and they're using things like MCT oil or other oils which can wreak havoc on your GI system and so forth. So that is a pure ketogenic diet where it's high fat. A lot of people, because of the fitness industry, call ketogenic dieting just a high protein diet. So fat might be moderate, there's some fat in there, carbs are still out of the picture, but then protein is high. It's actually harder to lose weight that way because your body can convert protein into glucose pretty easily when necessary. So if you're over consuming protein, you're just inefficiently getting some of that glucose without the advantage, and you're getting it from that excess protein. So from those two definitions, where can we find some value and use it for our advantage? Number one is just the use of fat in terms of satiety, not being as hungry. If I'm somebody who disposes of glucose really, really fast, and I might find that even just increasing my carbohydrates doesn't help. I'm constantly hungry. So maybe within my macronutrient profile, the amount of calories I'm giving myself, I could bring my carbs down a little bit and increase fat. And indeed, that can create a very strong effect of stabilizing energy and hunger, and you're just trading calories for calories. There's no harm in doing that. Some people have a kind of a principled mindset toward fat where they want certain amounts of essential fats, essential fatty acids, that kind of thing in their diet. And to make room for those, you might need to reduce carbs a little bit. You could even go as far as saying, well, maybe I just prefer fat. Maybe the foods in my diet that I like, I would much rather have some of those that are higher fat than these that are higher in carbs. So now you've got room to move even closer toward ketogenic dieting and yet leave some of those carbs in place. I don't have a problem with that at all. Some of that preference can be fantastic. And if you find that functionally you're just more insulin sensitive, you get a worse reaction from too much carbohydrates where you do feel lethargic and so forth. There are absolutely people who just prefer having a little bit more fat to too much carbohydrate. But again, it comes down to where are you drawing that line, and are we just using some of those ketogenic principles, or are we going into full ketogenic dieting mode, which is what I would recommend against. So another thing that it helps with is creating a little bit more space between meals like I talked about. So maybe a little extra fat in your diet, a little less carb can do that. You might have some gastric issues, some GI issues where too much fiber, too much carbohydrate gives you some inflammatory bowel symptoms and that kind of thing. And so a little bit more fat allows you to have less carbs, and so the quality of your bowel movements and your GI system functionality you might find improves a little bit. People who have constipation, for example, find that with that little extra fat, preferably from an unsaturated fat type oil, can help. So a lot of reasons why it's a good idea to try and go that direction if that's your preference. There are just ways to make sure that we can just embed these tools into our repertoire of skills so that if we want to try something we can, or we just find ourselves in that day where our foods naturally went that direction, we don't have to call that a failure. We can say, well, I did that and it actually worked out great. It just happened to be a little bit more toward that ketogenic side. So again, a lot more we could talk about there, but I just wanted to show you that we could use some of those principles and never call something, bad versus good. We don't need those qualitative statements when we're just dealing with science, when we can use some of those principles to still reach our goals. So let's go through a couple more of these guys over the next few days.